In 1314, flames devoured Jacques de Molay under a crimson eclipse. His dying whisper, 7 blood moon cycles, and from silence, the order rises. Templars vanished, ships from La Rochelle, symbols in Rosslyn stones, guarding celestial codes. Now, August 17th, 2027. A red eclipse shadows Portugal to Jerusalem, matching their timeline. Lost codices, reborn secrets, Vatican vaults and viral sundials scream, the veil lifts. Kings burned it. Symbols endured. What awakens? Dive in. Unravel the prophecy, like if it grips you. Share the chill. Subscribe for more. Comment. What rises in 2027? The fire climbed high in a courtyard of the temple. Smoke curled like black fingers into the early morning air, choking the sunrise above Paris. Chains rattled, not from resistance, but from ritual. Beneath a stone arch burned by years of torch soot, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, stood still. The executioners were quiet. The crowd was quieter. And then, as if timed to some forgotten celestial clock, the sun vanished. Not entirely. It was a rare thing, they said. A lunar eclipse, bleeding through the dawn haze, turning the world in shades of deep red and bruised violet. The effect was immediate. Panic and whispers, cries of omen from the superstitious. De Molay raised his head, his eyes locked on the veiled moon, and then he spoke. The words weren't fully recorded, not by any official hand, but fragments survive. Shadows of syllables scratched into prison walls and remembered in the trembling voices of those who watched him burn. Within 7 cycles of the crimson moon, truth shall awaken in the place of silence, and the order shall rise again beneath the mark of the red eclipse. 7 cycles. The phrase haunted the centuries that followed. Every significant lunar eclipse since 1314 has drawn quiet scrutiny, especially those tinged with red, blood moons, as they came to be known. Most passed without comment, but some were marked by upheaval, betrayal, the fall of powers once thought unshakable. And now, scholars and silent orders alike turn their eyes to the sky once more. Because in the year 2027, a rare blood moon will darken the earth again. On August 7th, to be precise, a red eclipse. Is it coincidence, a pattern of nature, or a thread in a much older design? The prophecy, if we dare call it that, was never formally accepted by the Church, nor was it outright condemned. Like many dangerous ideas, it lived in the space between memory and myth, hinted at in Masonic allegories, echoed in strange symbols found carved into remote chapels, painted in the margins of Crusader texts, whispered in the rituals of forgotten brotherhoods. It never vanished. It endured quietly. And now the whisper grows louder. You feel it, don't you? That tug at the edge of knowing. That moment when history feels more like a doorway than a tomb. What if the fire was never just about death, but about concealment? What if the moon that turned red in the smoke of Jacques de Molay's execution was a clock, not a coincidence? If the mystery of the red eclipse has drawn you in, hit subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. And share this if it sparks your curiosity. You're about to journey into a world of silent vows, forgotten geometry, and a riddle sealed in fire more than 7 centuries ago. Because Because this isn't just about prophecy. It's about control, about who gets to write history and who dares to read between the lines. Let's begin. The story of the Red Eclipse starts where most would believe it ends, in the ashes of the Templar Order. On the surface, the events are well documented. Arrests in 1307, torture, confessions, executions. But beneath that history lies another layer, stranger, quieter, and far more enduring. It is the layer of symbols. Consider this. At the time of the arrests, Templar envoys were allegedly traveling across Europe with sealed crates and coded scrolls. The contents were never recovered. Some claim they contained relics. Others believe it was knowledge, maps, perhaps, or calendars or astronomical guides deemed too dangerous. One persistent legend refers to the Crimson Chart, a document lost to the ages, written in both Greek and Aramaic, describing a celestial event that would mark the rebirth of an ancient order. Why would warrior monks track the stars? Why would an order sworn to poverty and faith bury coded messages in the geometry of stone cathedrals and pilgrimage routes? Unless, of course, they believed time itself could be measured, and that some moments, rare, red, and celestial, meant more than others. This is the world we are stepping into. A world where silence was armor and fire a form of communication, where the moon was more than light in the sky. It was a warning, a threshold, a cipher. You walk through this now. Yes, you imagine it. A cold chapel in the hills of northern Spain, the smell of dust and old paper. A faded mosaic in the shape of a circle bisected by flame. You kneel before it. You listen. Beneath your feet lies stone. But perhaps something more. A vault, a seal, or just memory waiting to be awakened. What if silence were not empty? What if the Red Eclipse prophecy is not a fable, but a code waiting to be fulfilled? And if it is real, why now? Why 2027? In the aftermath of the First Crusade, the streets of Jerusalem pulsed with tension. Dust clung to stone walls, still stained by the blood of conquest. And the newly claimed Holy City felt less like a sanctuary and more like a battleground between belief and survival. It was in this uncertain dawn that a small group of knights emerged, not for glory, not for plunder, but for something older. They were sworn not only to protect pilgrims of the treacherous roads of the Levant, but also to guard secrets buried deep beneath the Temple Mount itself. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would remember them simply as the Knights Templar. Their beginnings were modest. 9 knights, no wealth, no power, housed in the ruins believed to be the site of Solomon's temple. But what they found there, or believed they found, would ignite a transformation no one could have foreseen. For centuries afterward, rumors swirled that the early Templars excavated beneath the Temple Mount, seeking not just gold or weaponry, but sacred texts, forbidden maps, and artifacts tied to early Christianity, mysticism, and astronomical knowledge, far older than the Church itself. Within 2 decades, the order would explode in both influence and intrigue. Backed by powerful patrons and blessed by Pope Honorius II, the Templars were granted unique privileges: exemption from local laws, authority to cross borders freely, and, perhaps most importantly, permission to keep their findings secret. By the mid-12th century, they were not just monks or soldiers. They were bankers, builders, astronomers, and stewards of ancient lore. But why this obsession with the stars? Hidden within early Templar chapels are carvings, often overlooked, that resemble planetary alignments, phases of the moon, and geometric constellations unfamiliar to modern astronomy. One chapel in Portugal contains a stained glass window depicting a red disc suspended over a mountain range, accompanied by an inscription in Latin: Sanguis lunae porta temporis, blood of the moon, gateway of time. This was not idle decoration. The Templars saw patterns where others saw chaos in the heavens. They sought meaning. They believed certain moments in time were imbued with divine resonance, where the spiritual and material planes aligned. Eclipses, especially blood moons, were not omens of doom, but invitations to revelation. In private writings, a Templar scribe named Brother Mathieu described lunar eclipses as veils drawn from the face of divine memory. The term Red Eclipse appears in his margin notes as early as 1139, almost 200 years before Jacques de Molay's execution. Could the prophecy have begun there? It is important to understand the culture of secrecy that defined the Templars. Their rituals, rank structure, and encrypted symbols were not born solely from fear of persecution, but from a deeply held belief that certain truths were not for the unprepared. The world was not ready for prophecy. Not then, perhaps not now. At the heart of their philosophy lay the idea of cycles, of history moving not in a straight line, but in a spiral. The number 7 appears frequently in their architecture. 7 windows, 7 steps, 7 pointed stars. To them, 7 was a sacred interval. If we consider the phrase spoken by de Molay, 7 cycles of the crimson moon, and count forward, we arrive at the 21st century and the next rare blood moon to occur in a pattern fitting their preserved cycle, August 7th, 2027. This is not coincidence, at least not to those who carry the legacy. The Templars didn't just rise, they transformed the very infrastructure of Europe. From the coastlines of Portugal to the hills of Scotland, their strongholds were aligned with precise geographic and celestial markers. Some believe these alignments were part of a long-term timekeeping system, echoing ancient practices found in Egypt and Sumer. It's the idea that certain sites were built not for worship, but for activation, waiting for the right configuration of the heavens. This concept, called temporal geometry, survives today in the rituals of some fringe esoteric societies. Most dismiss it as pseudoscience. But what if the Templars encoded more than metaphor? What if the Red Eclipse prophecy was designed not just to predict a date, but to awaken action? There is one final detail from this era, easily overlooked but chilling in hindsight. In 1147, the Templars were present at the siege of Lisbon. It was a brutal affair, but their records of the battle contain an odd footnote. During the night before the final charge, a lunar eclipse darkened the sky. It was said that the knights knelt together silently, weapons lowered, eyes fixed upward. One chronicler wrote that the moon wept red and the temple did not speak. Nothing more, no explanation. But that phrase, "the temple did not speak," appears again centuries later in cryptic notes attributed to a 17th century Masonic order tracing its lineage to the Templars. The same phrase is etched into a forgotten chamber beneath an abbey in Languedoc. Why repeat such a thing unless it mattered? The origins of the Templars are usually told as the story of warriors defending pilgrims or bankers securing trade. But if we listen more closely, the subtext is undeniable. They were watchers of the sky, keepers of rhythm, architects of silence, and perhaps, just perhaps, bearers of a prophecy tied to the blood-red moon. The rise of the order was not just military or economic. It was spiritual, esoteric, and deeply astronomical. And somewhere in that rise, the seed of the Red Eclipse prophecy was sown quietly, deliberately, and with a patience that defies our modern understanding of time. The question then is not whether the prophecy exists. The question is whether we are ready to understand it. It began not with swords, but with sealed letters. On a cold October morning in 1307, couriers spread like shadows across France. Each bore the same message, handwritten by King Philip IV and marked with his private seal. Arrest every member of the Knights Templar. The operation was coordinated, swift, and merciless. By the end of the day, hundreds of knights had been seized. Their properties were confiscated, their chapels broken open, their voices silenced. But something about the silence felt planned. In Paris, as dawn broke over the Seine, black-clad guards battered down the doors of the Templar stronghold. What they found shocked them. Not resistance, but evacuation. Many chambers were empty. The treasure vaults had been cleared, documents burned or missing. It was as if the Templars had known, as if they had been waiting. And in truth, they had for years. Whispers of tension between the French crown and the order had circulated. King Philip IV, heavily indebted to the Templars for financing his wars, had grown resentful of their autonomy, their wealth, and their secrets. The Church, wary of the order's growing independence and strange rituals, turned a blind eye as Philip plotted their downfall. But even with this brewing storm, the sheer efficiency of the Templar disappearance suggested more than mere anticipation. It hinted at a contingency, a plan designed long before Philip ever lifted his pen. Among the surviving records is a letter from a Templar scribe in Rouen. It was never delivered, hidden within a false bottom of a reliquary. It reads, "The signs are aligning. The crimson veil nears. If this reaches you, enact the 7th seal. Time must not fall silent." The language is cryptic, but if we consider that in Templar lore, the phrase 7th seal corresponds with cycles of celestial time, and that crimson veil likely refers to a lunar eclipse, we see something chilling. The fall of the Templars may not have been the end of the order. It may have been its ignition. The trials that followed were brutal. Under torture, knights confessed to heresies, both absurd and impossible. worship of idols, spitting on the cross, secret kisses. But these confessions were riddled with contradictions. One common thread did emerge, however, though often redacted or overlooked. A name, Baphomet. Many theories swirl around the origin of this name. Some say it's a corruption of Muhammad, used to accuse the Templars of Islamic sympathies. Others believe it's a code word, possibly a cipher. But a small number of historians have suggested that Baphomet was not a person or idol, but a concept, balance through opposition, duality, eclipse. A report from the inquisitors in Poitiers includes an unusual note. One knight, whose name was stricken from the final transcript, reportedly shouted before dying, "The moon shall darken, and blood shall awaken the temple." It was dismissed as madness, but viewed through the lens of the Red Eclipse theory, such a cry feels deliberate, perhaps even prophetic. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was imprisoned for 7 years. During that time, he was interrogated, humiliated, and likely tortured. Yet by all accounts, he never fully broke. He denied the charges. He stood defiant. And when his execution came in 1314, he walked to the pyre with unshaken resolve. The flames consumed him slowly. Eyewitnesses claimed he stared into the sky as he burned, lips moving, speaking words that were drowned by fire and wind. Only fragments survive, passed from voice to voice in secret over centuries. The most persistent version of his final words, Clement, Philip, "Before a year is done, you shall face judgment before God. The veil shall return. The temple will not die." And history recorded that within a year, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV were dead. Coincidence, perhaps, but for the Templar sympathizers who survived in exile, this was seen not as vengeance, but validation. From this moment, a legend was born, that Jacques de Molay had spoken a curse, that the eclipse overhead had marked the prophecy's first seal, that somewhere within the flames, a celestial clock had been reset. This turning point, the fall of the order, was not the extinguishing of a flame, but its concealment. Like embers buried under ash, it smoldered in secret. Templar ships vanished from ports, supposedly lost at sea. Yet years later, similar vessels were seen bearing unfamiliar flags, arriving in distant harbors. Knights who escaped captivity disappeared into mountains, deserts, and monasteries under new names. And in some parts of Europe, particularly Scotland and Portugal, chapels began to appear with strange symbolism, moons eclipsed by crosses, red stars etched into stone. And there was another whisper, quieter, harder to trace, that a small circle of Templars had smuggled something out of France during the arrests. Not gold, but a manuscript, a calendar, a prophecy. No one can say for certain, but its name surfaces again and again in apocryphal texts. The Crimson Codex. No copy has ever been found, only references. One from a 15th century Scottish mason describing the scroll that names the Red Moon and speaks of kings undone. Another from a Portuguese monk who claimed to have hidden the Crimson Book within the walls of an unnamed coastal abbey. The last reference, a 19th century American esotericist who claimed the codex was encoded within the architecture of a Boston cathedral. Wild, maybe, but if you're still with this story, then perhaps you already sense it. That uncanny consistency, the repeated appearance of eclipses, crimson, sevens, and silence. The fall of the Templars was a public spectacle, but what happened in the shadows was something else entirely. A transformation, a redirection, perhaps even the beginning of the prophecy we now approach. The fire did not destroy the Templars. It obscured them. The moon did not mourn them. It marked them. And if the legends are to be believed, the Red Eclipse of 2027 may be more than a date. It may be a signal. To understand a prophecy, one must understand the people who carried it. History remembers Jacques de Molay as the final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, a man consumed by fire and legend. But behind the ceremonial titles and martyrdom were men of flesh, ambition, and vision, each with motivations layered in faith, fear, and secrecy. Some acted to preserve power, others, perhaps, to preserve prophecy. The Red Eclipse legend, if it ever truly existed in written form, would not have survived by accident. It required stewards, hidden hands, minds that grasped the weight of silence and the power of timing. Jacques de Molay stands first in the line of suspects, not merely for his final words, but for his actions in the years leading to the Order's fall. He resisted attempts to merge the Templars with the Knights Hospitaller, a move favored by Pope Clement V and King Philip IV. Publicly, this was framed as politics. But what if de Molay's resistance stemmed from something deeper? The Hospitallers were not sworn to the same secrets. They were not bound by the same oaths. Perhaps de Molay feared that merging the two would expose the Templars' most sacred trust, the prophecy. If the Red Eclipse manuscript truly existed, it would have needed protection from not only enemies, but allies with different values. Then there was Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, arrested alongside de Molay. Less known to the general public, de Charnay held critical knowledge of the Order's internal codes and financial archives. But more importantly, he was rumored to be the guardian of one of the Templars' most enigmatic relics, the object we now call the Shroud of Turin. While mainstream history debates the shroud's origin, some believe it was hidden or moved during the mass arrests. And buried in a footnote of a suppressed 17th century manuscript is a line that reads, "Charnay bore the mark and the scroll, one to mislead, one to awaken." Could this suggest he held a copy or a portion of the Red Eclipse prophecy? The story widens when we examine Guillaume de Beaujeu, another Grand Master who preceded de Molay and died defending Acre in 1291. His writings, recovered in fragments from a scribe's notes, hint at a troubling awareness. "The moon bleeds often in the sky of Jerusalem," he wrote. "But one day it shall not bleed alone. When it does, the temple must sleep." The phrasing is odd, especially the idea that the temple must sleep. That wording aligns with later Masonic allegories of the sleeping order, a term occasionally linked to the Templars in exile. It raises the question, were these leaders aware of a long-term celestial timetable? were they acting under the shadow of a distant, red-marked day? Of course, no discussion of motivations is complete without mentioning King Philip IV of France. His hatred of the Templars is often attributed to his crippling debt and lust for power. But there are accounts, rare and often disputed, that suggest Philip feared something else. An Italian diplomat recorded in a private letter that the king had received warnings of a crimson veil and the downfall of kings in the year before the arrests. He claimed the king consulted with astrologers, one of whom predicted a fall beneath the bloodied moon. The diplomat's tone is skeptical, yet the record exists. If true, it suggests that Philip believed the Templars were planning something tied to prophecy and acted to destroy them before that prophecy could unfold. Then there's Pope Clement V, caught between loyalty to Philip and fear of the order. Some historians portray him as a reluctant pawn, others as a calculating suppressor of a dangerous movement. But one little-known document complicates the narrative. In the Vatican's suppressed archives, what some call the Secretum, there's a scroll catalogued as Fragmentum Quiextiva, written in Latin and partially burned. It references a lunaris testamentum, a lunar testament, delivered to the Pope in Avignon. The scroll's author is unnamed, but claims that the veiled moon shall mark the gate, and only the worthy may endure its light. The rest is lost to fire or censorship. But why would such language reach the Pope unless someone believed the prophecy was real? Moving further into the realm of hidden stewards, we encounter the lesser-known figure of Brother Anselm of Poitou, a Templar archivist. Though not a leader in the traditional sense, Anselm was believed to be the keeper of encrypted manuscripts in the Rouen commandery. A single page attributed to his hand survives, preserved in a private collection. It contains only a diagram, a crescent overlap in a full circle, surrounded by 7 smaller orbs. Underneath, a simple phrase, "Through silence, the eclipse shall speak." This is one of the earliest known symbolic representations of the Red Eclipse theory. Anselm's disappearance following the purge of the order remains unexplained, yet perhaps the most enigmatic figure tied to the prophecy is not a Templar at all. It is the mysterious Red Monk, an unnamed figure mentioned in several 15th century accounts by Freemasonic scribes and German mystics. Described as a hooded man bearing a crimson cloak embroidered with stars and moons, he is said to have appeared at times of political unrest, whispering warnings of eclipses and rebirth. One chronicler writes, "He carried a book that opened to no known language, but from its pages fell ash upon the flame. Most dismiss the Red Monk as myth, but some speculate he was a surviving Templar or a messenger of the legacy, carrying forward the prophecy into the era of secret societies." What binds these individuals, de Molay, de Charnay, de Beaujeu, Clement, Philip, Anselm, even the Red Monk, is not just history, but timing. Each lived during a critical junction in the order's fate. Each acted, whether by betrayal or preservation, with awareness that something larger loomed just beyond the veil. Whether they believed in the prophecy as literal truth or metaphorical destiny, their choices suggest a hidden rhythm at work. If the Red Eclipse prophecy was preserved through human hands, then it was these hands, shaken, strong, desperate, or visionary, that carried it, and they would not be the last. Because prophecy, especially one tied to celestial time, does not need belief to persist. It only needs memory and someone willing to listen. There are mysteries that live in the silence between pages, buried beneath the weight of history, not because they were forgotten, but because they were protected. The Red Eclipse is one such mystery, not a legend of conquest or crusade, but a whisper threaded through time, a ciphered idea passed from firelit walls to coded manuscripts, emerging not in loud proclamations, but in patterns. To unveil the heart of the Templar prophecy is to ask one question that echoes across centuries. What did they see in the sky that we were never meant to understand? The prophecy, as described in scattered fragments and speculative reconstructions, centers around a celestial event. A total lunar eclipse, described in crimson terms, tied to the collapse and rebirth of structures of power. This red eclipse, it is said, is both a marker and a key. The eclipse does not cause the transformation. It reveals the moment when change is possible. To the Templars, who watched the skies with the same devotion they gave to scripture, certain events were not random, but rhythmic, part of a divine design obscured only by our failure to perceive it. A 14th century parchment found in a monastic ruin in Navarre describes a veil of red shadow passing over the moon, beneath which the temple sleeps and the unbroken seal turns to ash. Though the document is fragmented and partially erased by time, scholars have long noted its alignment with the Templar esoteric worldview. It speaks not of war or judgment, but of awakening, a cosmic alignment, precise and rare, that signals the return or reactivation of a hidden order. The text refers repeatedly to the seventh gate, likely referencing cycles of 7 lunar eclipses, a numerical pattern that appears frequently in Templar architecture and ritual design. At the core of the prophecy appears to be a belief in cosmic windows, brief, astronomically significant periods when knowledge, hidden or obscured, can be reclaimed. These windows are not arbitrary. They are calculated with great care, using a mixture of lunar calendars, sacred geometry, and ancient Sumerian star charts, some of which were rumored to be in Templar possession after their excavations beneath the Temple Mount. One of the few semi-complete references to this event is found in a document known as the Codex Obscura, a 16th century manuscript held in the archives of a Swiss Masonic lodge. In it, the following passage appears, translated from a Latin-Greek hybrid dialect. When the seventh shadow shall fall upon the moon, and earth be bathed in crimson, the temple shall stir in silence. The watchers shall return to their stations, and the seal shall open. This passage has haunted historians and occult researchers alike. The language suggests not merely a prophecy, but a timed mechanism, something sealed, an idea, a structure, a purpose, awaits a specific alignment to be unlocked. Some interpret this literally, imagining hidden vaults or underground chambers. Others believe it refers to consciousness, a collective awakening tied to planetary cycles. Either way, the eclipse becomes the pivot around which silence becomes revelation. Throughout Templar iconography, subtle hints to the Red Eclipse surface. In a cathedral in Tomar, Portugal, one of the last known Templar strongholds, an intricate carving above the altar shows a cloaked figure kneeling beneath a blood-red moon, hands open, eyes blindfolded. The words beneath read, Per lunam, veritas. Through the moon, truth. Nearby, 7 stars spiral outward from the figure's hands. To the untrained eye, it's art. To those familiar with the pattern, it's a signal. The prophecy was never intended to be shouted from towers. It was written in symbols, embedded in stained glass, encoded in stone, whispered into vaults where sound barely traveled. The Templars, like many ancient initiatory orders, believed that truth was dangerous when given too soon, that knowledge must be earned, not received, that time is not a line, but a spiral, and every spiral has its echo. The Red Eclipse is such an echo, resonating across time, waiting to align again. Interestingly, the prophecy doesn't predict apocalypse, as many have assumed. It speaks of return, judgment, and rebalancing. The term collapse appears frequently, but always paired with awakening or rebirth. In this way, the Templar prophecy echoes ancient Zoroastrian beliefs, as well as the Mayan understanding of temporal cycles, where the end of one age is simply the veil lifting on another. In this context, the Red Eclipse of 2027 isn't a cataclysm, but a threshold. And what lies on the other side? According to some interpretations, the prophecy aligns with the appearance of a new architect, not a person necessarily, but a force. A collective realignment of purpose. Some have speculated that this refers to technological advancement, an era where humanity reconnects with cosmic patterns through data and digital memory. Others believe it signals the resurgence of lost orders, Templar descendants, silent fraternities who have waited for this alignment to complete their ancient vow. A few go further, suggesting that the eclipse will mark the revelation of truths long buried. Relics, scrolls, locations, and teachings sealed away in anticipation of this precise moment. A few modern thinkers have traced this alignment to other events. In August 2027, the total lunar eclipse will pass over parts of North Africa and the Middle East, regions rich in Templar history, Crusader woes, and biblical prophecy. The path of totality crosses deserts once traveled by Templar envoys and ancient cities where early Christian mysteries first bloomed. The idea that such an eclipse would pass over these sacred sites has stirred interest from quiet corners, esoteric think tanks, silent monastic orders, and independent researchers alike. They ask the same question you may be asking now. Did the Templars know? Did they predict the alignment of this very eclipse more than 700 years ago? Or were they simply preserving a more ancient calculation? Something passed down from older civilizations, perhaps even pre-Diluvian cultures, whose understanding of astronomy and divine timing far exceeded our own. The veil of time is hard to pierce, but the Red Eclipse prophecy, if we listen closely, speaks to more than just an event. It speaks to a design, a pattern that does not demand belief, but invites observation. the moon turns red, the silence deepens, and somewhere in that silence, a seal breaks, not with thunder, but with memory. It is not the sound of a prophecy fulfilled. It is the sound of one returning. Evidence is not always loud. Sometimes it hums just beneath the surface of accepted history, half-formed, worn thin by time, dismissed as coincidence. But for those who look closely, there are fragments, clues, traces that when gathered with care form the outline of something more. A design once hidden in shadow, now flickering into the light. The Red Eclipse prophecy is not inscribed in a single book or carved into a monolith. It lives in the margins, the misfiled scrolls, the forgotten chapels. This is where we begin. In the Rosslyn Chapel of Scotland, long associated with Templar legends, there is a sequence of stone carvings that baffles conventional historians. Along the inner walls of the chapel are 213 unique cubes, each bearing a geometric pattern. While some dismiss them as decorative flourishes, others suggest they are encoded with musical and mathematical sequences that align with lunar cycles. In 2005, a father-son duo of musicians claimed to decode part of the pattern into a harmonic scale, with one segment matching a progression tied to the Saros cycle, the ancient method for predicting eclipses. One particular symbol, repeated 7 times, resembles a circle bleeding into darkness. Local oral traditions refer to it simply as the blood moon key. Farther south, in a Portuguese chapel built atop a Templar commandery in Tomar, another strange feature presents itself. Beneath the main altar, accessed through a narrow spiral stair, lies a chamber no wider than a well. On its domed ceiling, faded with age, are painted 7 overlapping circles. At their center, a single crimson star, once vibrant, now nearly lost to smoke and candle soot. The symbol is aligned with an architectural slit that allows moonlight to pass through for only a few nights every 18 years, coinciding precisely with the recurrence of the same lunar eclipse pattern expected in 2027. The locals call this alignment a janela do silencio, the window of silence. No official record explains its purpose. Then there is the Chartres Cathedral in France, a structure often tied to esoteric symbology and sacred geometry. The labyrinth inlaid into the cathedral's stone floor contains subtle, deliberate distortions that break the pattern at 7 points. Points that, when mapped, form the outline of a crescent moon intersected by a straight line. In the margins of a 15th century architectural manual associated with Chartres, a monk wrote, "Mark the shadows, not the stones. The truth turns red before it turns gold." Some believe this refers to a hidden chamber or coded timeline embedded within the cathedral's design. And yet, not all traces are found in stone. In 1889, a farmer in southern Spain unearthed a sealed terracotta jar while digging a foundation near the ruins of an old abbey. Inside were 3 brittle scrolls, mostly illegible, but one contained a partial diagram, concentric circles with dates and lunar symbols, surrounded by archaic Latin phrases. A rough translation reads, "When the shadow turns to flame, the sleeping seal will open. The 7th sign shall not pass unseen." The scroll was purchased by a private collector and has not been publicly displayed since 1923. Photographs from the time show one disturbing detail: a small cross drawn in red ink at the center of the circle, beneath a faded crescent. These are not isolated anomalies. From German libraries to Turkish monasteries, from dusty Vatican corridors to New World Masonic vaults, references to crimson moons, seven seals, and silent awakenings resurface again and again. They are often buried in texts considered apocryphal, Gnostic, or heretical. In a 14th century copy of the apocryphal Visions of Esdras, inserted between the margins by an unknown hand, is a drawing of a man kneeling beneath a red eclipse, arms raised. The caption beneath it reads simply, "Templum obscurum expectate." Dark temple. Wait. Digital analysis of medieval astronomical texts conducted in the early 2000s revealed multiple instances of unusual notations around eclipses, particularly those matching the red-hued total eclipses known today as blood moons. A study by an Italian university catalogued 27 medieval documents referencing red veil events. Most were dismissed as poetic flourishes, but the same phrasing appears in Templar records, Masonic rituals, and even in Islamic texts describing the crimson cloak of the Watchers. The recurrence is difficult to ignore. Perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence comes not from Europe, but from the New World. In Nova Scotia, where some theorize Templar ships may have arrived centuries before Columbus, lies the infamous Oak Island. The island's mysterious money pit has captivated treasure hunters for generations. Among the strange findings there, wooden platforms, coconut fibers, a stone with cryptic symbols, was a piece of parchment bearing the words 40 FT below, 2 seals break, and a symbol resembling a red crescent above a cross. Some speculate this hints at a hidden Templar archive, sealed until a predetermined celestial moment. Theories abound, none confirmed, but the eclipse in 2027 will cast its shadow over the Atlantic. Could it be a coincidence? Then there's the Crimson Codex, mentioned in whispers, but never found. Some believe fragments of it exist under different names, scattered across Europe like shattered glass. In a rare 17th century French folio titled Le Livre d'Ordre, a passage describes a book that opens only when the stars burn red and the bells are silent. It suggests that this book, lost or hidden, contains not just prophecy, but a map, a celestial roadmap to a long-planned unveiling. And so, the evidence piles, not in certainty, but in suggestion. Taken alone, any one of these clues might be dismissed: a curiosity, an echo, a trick of time. But together, they create a pattern, a mosaic waiting for the final piece. And that piece may be the eclipse in 2027, a date calculated centuries ago, buried in stone and scroll, and now rapidly approaching. What would happen if the pieces are aligned? What if the window of silence opens? What if the map etched in stained glass becomes legible under crimson light? What if the seals, whatever they are, begin to crack? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Because history often hides its most powerful truths not in proclamations, but in traces. In the footsteps left behind by those who saw too far and spoke too little. The fire was meant to erase them. The confessions, the torture, the ash, all carefully orchestrated to silence the order forever. But fire, as the Templars knew well, does not only destroy, it transforms. And in the months and years that followed the mass arrests of 1307, a quieter movement unfolded beneath the surface of Europe. Ships vanished from ports. Names disappeared from rosters. Some died. Others adapted. If the Red Eclipse prophecy was to survive, it could not remain in plain sight. It had to move, to hide, to change its name, but not its nature. What followed is less a record and more a trail. A trail marked by strange architecture, whispered traditions, and unexpected alliances. Historians often focus on the destruction of the order, but few ask how. Despite the coordinated purge, so many assets, symbols, and echoes of the Templar world managed to persist. The answer may lie in escape, not as retreat, but as strategy. An escape designed centuries in advance, a dispersal with purpose. Let us begin in La Rochelle, the western French port, from which many Templar ships sailed. According to a 14th century maritime registry, several vessels vanished in the weeks after the arrests. No wreckage was found, no destinations recorded. Rumors suggest the fleet set sail toward Portugal, Scotland, and even the shores of the New World. One legend claims that among the ships was a heavily guarded vessel known only as La Sombra, the Shadow, carrying sealed chests and 3 knights who had sworn a final vow to guard the crimson truth until the moon bleeds once more. In Portugal, King Dinis refused to persecute the Templars. Instead, he created the Order of Christ in 1319, transferring much of the Templar infrastructure into this newly named brotherhood. The change was cosmetic. Beneath the banner and new seals, many of the same men continued their mission. It was within the Order of Christ that new temples were constructed, bearing the same motifs: 7 stars, lunar crescents, and red crosses. Some chapels included astronomical features, windows aligned with the moon's cycle, stone carvings of eclipses hidden behind altars. In effect, Portugal became a sanctuary not only for the survivors, but for the prophecy. Scotland, too, played a role, though more in shadow than in light. Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Pope, had little reason to enforce papal edicts. The Templars found refuge in his lands, and their presence can be traced in the sudden appearance of unmarked tombs, labyrinthine chapel designs, and sword-inscribed stones in places where no official Templar commandery ever existed. The most famous of these sites is Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century by the Sinclair family, descendants of those who, according to legend, had ties to the Templar escapees. The chapel is saturated with astronomical symbolism, including depictions of what appear to be American flora, carved decades before Columbus sailed west. Could this be coincidence? Or is it possible that a branch of the order reached the Americas centuries early, bearing not conquest, but prophecy? Native oral histories from the northeast of North America include curious references to pale men with red markings who arrived in the time before the memory of iron. In one Algonquin legend, a group of strangers arrived by ship, bearing scrolls and star maps. They built no cities and did not stay long, but left behind circular stone markers and a story. that one day the moon would turn red and the great silence would end. Whether this tale is connected to the Templars is uncertain, but it mirrors their language, their symbols, their obsession with silence and eclipses. Another path of survival lies in ritual transmission. As the physical order dissolved, its knowledge passed inward into coded rituals, oral oaths, and layered traditions. Many of these customs found new homes in emerging groups: stonemason guilds, cathedral builders, and eventually the early Freemasons. Documents from the 16th and 17th centuries reveal Masonic initiation rites referring to the silent architect, a figure said to return when the crimson veil is drawn across the sky. These aren't random flourishes. They are carryovers, fragments of a deeper story too dangerous to write plainly. The Hughes manuscript, a controversial document from the 1700s, describes a ritual involving 7 steps, 7 candles, and a silver circle. The final phrase spoken, "When fire climbs the tower and the moon runs red, the seal shall break and the path shall open." The phrase bears remarkable similarity to Templar-era inscriptions and Portuguese oral traditions surrounding eclipse rituals held in secret groves during certain lunar phases. If these echoes are more than coincidence, they point to a sustained, deliberate preservation of knowledge rooted in Templar survival across Europe and beyond. One sees consistency not in politics or dogma, but in motif: the red cross, the circle within a circle, the silence of the moon. These symbols endured not because they were convenient, but because they were portable. Unlike gold or parchment, they could be carved, remembered, passed on in song, etched into stone thresholds or cathedral spires. You see them today, even if you don't notice, in old churches, in Masonic lodges, in weathered tombs with no names. The story survives not in books, but in shapes, in numbers, and in the stars. And that brings us to the most curious feature of the Templar survival: timing. The eclipse cycle is not accidental. Those who survived, those who guarded the fragments of the Red Eclipse prophecy, seem to have understood the need for patience. 7 eclipses, 7 seals, 7 generations. Every recurrence is a checkpoint, a moment to observe and measure. The fact that so many encoded symbols are designed to interact with moonlight is not merely poetic. It is functional. The architecture waits, the watchers wait, and soon the moon will bleed again. Why preserve such a prophecy for so long? Why protect it through exile, war, migration, and centuries of silence? Perhaps the Templars believed they had seen something, a revelation not meant for their time, but for ours. And so they ran, not away from death, but toward the future, carrying a seed, hiding it in code, leaving it for those willing to follow the path. And now, as 2027 nears, the path grows clearer. The eclipse returns, the seals groan, the watchers stir. The fire did not consume the prophecy. It scattered it like embers on the wind. Some died. Others became the wind. And now it circles back. No prophecy survives 7 centuries by chance. It requires hands to carry it, minds to guard it, and alliances to shield it from the storm of history. The Templars, once the most powerful military and financial force in Christendom, were dismantled in a matter of years. But the silence that followed their fall was not the silence of death. It was the silence of strategy. Hidden within that quiet laid networks of allegiance, brotherhood, and shared belief, stretching across Europe and beyond. These alliances were not formed on battlefields, but in crypts, workshops, and midnight gatherings, where loyalty was sworn not to kings, but to something far older. The first and most immediate alliance came through Portugal, as mentioned in the last section, where King Dinas protected the fleeing Templars under a different name, the Order of Christ. But this transformation was more than a bureaucratic disguise. It was a conduit. The Order of Christ absorbed Templar traditions, symbols, and command structures, yet operated under papal approval. Their influence became crucial during the Age of Exploration, when Portuguese navigators charted the coasts of Africa, India, and Brazil. Many of these voyages bore sails marked with a red cross, a symbol curiously preserved from Templar design. Some believe these journeys were not only for commerce and conquest, but part of a longer arc, a rediscovery of old knowledge tied to the Red Eclipse prophecy. Then came the Masons, not yet the modern Freemasons, but the operative guilds of stonemasons responsible for building cathedrals across Europe. These craftsmen, often illiterate in the traditional sense, held a different literacy, one of stone, line, and angle. The Templars had employed these masons in their architectural endeavors, and in the aftermath of their fall, many believe fragments of Templar thought passed into these guilds. Symbols like the compass and square, the all-seeing eye, and the twin pillars began to surface more consistently in lodge iconography. These weren't random flourishes. They were carriers of legacy, visual echoes of something deeper. By the 17th century, speculative Freemasonry emerged, incorporating spiritual, philosophical, and historical layers into the older trade-based guilds. Some of the earliest lodges claim Templar descent, whether literal or symbolic. In certain initiation rites, one finds references to a sleep-in order, 7 lights, and a crimson moon over the temple. In a now restricted Scottish rite, initiates once recited a phrase translated roughly as, "When the veil turns red, the builder returns." The phrase echoes the language found in Portuguese eclipse rituals and the suspected fragments of the Crimson Codex. Again, the recurrence is too precise to ignore. Further alliances took shape through monastic orders that had reason to distrust the Church's political machinery. In particular, the Carthusians and Cistercians maintained libraries of obscure theological and astrological works. In several Carthusian texts, hidden among homilies and psalms, are notes about the Watchers, those who remain unnamed, keeping vigil for the hour marked in the heavens. The exact identities of these Watchers are unclear, but the phrasing aligns with earlier Templar references and later Rosicrucian writings, suggesting a quiet cooperation between mystic-minded monks and displaced Templar cells. And then there are the Rosicrucians, an elusive group who emerged in the early 1600s, publishing manifestos filled with symbols of rebirth, hidden knowledge, and cosmic alignment. Their roots are debated, but many researchers suggest Rosicrucianism was a fusion movement. Part alchemical revival, part Templar heritage, part Renaissance esoterica. In the Fama Fraternitatis, their first public declaration, references to a sleeping order, a returning age, and celestial signs abound. One particular phrase, "The time shall come when the east and west shall be veiled in red and the temple doors opened anew," has drawn attention from eclipse researchers, as it aligns with the projected path of the 2027 lunar eclipse and the symbolic language used in Templar prophecy. But the web extends further still. In the Ottoman Empire, there are records of Sufi mystics who spoke of ancient brotherhoods traveling west after the fall of Jerusalem. Some 15th century Persian texts mention the men of the Red Hour, who carried with them star charts and maps drawn not in ink, but in layered script, suggestive of encryption. While many dismiss these references as allegory, one scroll preserved in Istanbul contains a calendar remarkably similar to Templar eclipse tables discovered in Tomar. The idea that such knowledge could have crossed cultural lines is not just possible, it is probable. Mysticism, unlike politics, does not recognize borders. Even in the Americas, signs of hidden alliances flicker. In the early Spanish missions of the New World, certain chapels bear architectural anomalies, rose windows aligned to lunar cycles, labyrinths beneath the nave, symbols carved where no official doctrine permitted them. In one Jesuit report from 1681, a missionary describes a tribal leader in South America who referred to the red shadow watchers and drew in the dirt a perfect crescent nested in a cross. The missionary dismissed it as pagan nonsense, but the image appears elsewhere. In Portuguese chapels, Scottish crypts, and Templar manuscripts. The consistency across cultures, continents, and centuries suggests more than parallel invention. It suggests communication, not overt, not written in plain sight, but passed in whisper, symbol, and alignment. A web of alliances, some intentional, others emergent, all carrying the same undercurrent. The Red Eclipse must not be lost. What do these networks have in common? A belief in cycles, a reverence for geometry, a trust in silence, and an awareness, however partial, that time itself can be marked not only by calendars, but by ritual thresholds. These groups understood that prophecy is not about inevitability. It is about redness, timing, the eclipse. Then is not the event. It is the invitation. To protect that invitation, alliances were formed. Symbols were shared. Knowledge encoded in the most durable medium of all, ritual and architecture. These were not merely buildings or brotherhoods. They were living vaults, guarding a signal set long ago. Now, as the Red Eclipse approaches once more, the web begins to vibrate. Fragments long separated begin to align. The alliances, whether still intact or scattered in memory, have done their work. The knowledge has not been lost. It has been distributed, and the signal is returning. Where there is prophecy, there is always suppression. Not because the words are dangerous in themselves, but because of what they awaken. The possibility that history is incomplete, that the future is shaped by forces beyond thrones and councils. The Red Eclipse prophecy, if it ever lived as more than whispers, has endured the slow grind of intentional silence. Its survival is remarkable, not just because it crossed centuries, but because so many tried to erase it. Fire, censorship, heresy trials. These were not accidents of chaos, but deliberate efforts to unwrite a hidden script. From the moment of the Templars' downfall in 1307, the machinery of suppression began to turn. King Philip IV of France, driven by debts and paranoia, issued decree after decree not only to seize lands and assets, but to confiscate all documents and ritual materials belonging to the order. In Paris alone, over 20 chests of scrolls and ledgers were taken. Most were never seen again. Royal archives make passing reference to a set of lunar tables and a sealed codex inscribed with a red cross. They are not listed among the official church records of the trials. Their location today is unknown. The Vatican played its own role in silencing the deeper threads of the Templar tradition. Pope Clement V, eager to appease Philip while preserving the church's control, convened the Council of Vienne in 1312. There, the order was formally dissolved. But buried in the minutes of that council are repeated mentions of documents too sensitive for public inclusion. One cardinal reportedly objected to the destruction of a document of eclipses, calling it a theological paradox that should thus be aired before the uninitiated. The scroll was never catalogued in official inventories. Some believe it was either burned or relocated to the Vatican's secret archives, a library known to house thousands of unreleased documents, many dating from the Templar period. In the centuries that followed, the Church launched several waves of internal purges aimed at non-canonical knowledge. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or Index of Forbidden Books, first published in 1559, included a number of esoteric and astronomical texts that contained symbols associated with Templar prophecy, such as red eclipses, seven-pointed stars, and geometrical lunar diagrams. The reasoning was always the same: heresy, mysticism, deviation from dogma. But some scholars argue the real fear was that these books preserve fragments of the Templar worldview, one in which power was written in the stars, not in Rome. The suppression wasn't limited to texts. Structures, too, were targeted. In France and Italy, chapels known to be built or funded by former Templar affiliates were razed or repurposed. Stone carvings were chipped away. Murals were whitewashed. Stained glass windows were restored with new, less suspicious imagery. In the Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, a 14th century manuscript details the removal of a ceiling fresco of crimson orbs and the veiled moon due to confusion it sows among the novices. A later inspection of the abbey found no trace of the artwork. During the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, the struggle over sacred memory intensified. Protestant and Catholic authorities alike targeted anything deemed cultic or apocalyptic. In the fires of Geneva and Seville, entire libraries were destroyed. Some of these contained Templar relics, books, maps, letters. One lost volume, known only as Danguin Luna, was referenced by both Lutheran reformers and Jesuit inquisitors as a most potent and dangerous book, rumored to describe in detail the crimson veil that precedes upheaval. The book disappeared. Its title survives only in passing mentions across multiple centuries. But suppression was not only institutional, it was covert. As knowledge shifted into the hands of secret societies and hermetic orders, efforts to erase it became more surgical. In the 18th century, as Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism rose in visibility, so too did infiltration efforts by church spies and state agents. Inquisitorial reports from Spain and Italy contain transcripts of lodge rituals, many altered or redacted. One such report describes a ritual involving 7 circles drawn in chalk, with candles lit to the cycle of the red shadow. The informant who reported it was later found dead. His notes were burned, save for a single surviving copy archived in Milan. Following the revolution, anti-Masonic hysteria took hold. Many lodges were dissolved, symbols were banned, private libraries were seized. The Napoleonic regime, though tolerant in some respects, feared alternative historical narratives that challenged state power. In 1805, a Masonic lodge in Lyon was raided. Among the seized items was a manuscript titled La prophétie du Temple Rouge, the prophecy of the Red Temple. The manuscript was destroyed, but a priest sympathetic to the lodge later rewrote fragments from memory, including this passage: "The veil shall return in cycles of silence. When the watchers rise again, none shall say they were not warned." Suppression extended even into modernity. In the 20th century, as esoteric research experienced a resurgence, new methods of erasure appeared. Academics who ventured too far into Templar astronomy or eclipse lore often found their work dismissed as fringe. Funding disappeared. Publishing contracts were revoked. One British scholar who authored a thesis titled Crimson Alignments, Templar Geometry and Celestial Rites found her degree revoked and her archives sealed. Her research included the claim that the 2027 eclipse matches a 7-cycle pattern embedded in 14th century Templar carvings. Coincidence or a new form of suppression, one hidden behind peer review and institutional control? Digital suppression has emerged as the modern version of censorship. Websites discussing the Red Eclipse and its links to Templar lore have mysteriously gone offline. Video content referencing these patterns has vanished from platforms without explanation. Online forums discussing the connection between the 2027 eclipse and medieval prophecies are regularly flagged for misinformation, even when citing historical documents. The tools have changed, the fear has not. And yet, for every effort to silence the prophecy, the whisper has grown stronger. Perhaps it is because fire can only destroy so much. Symbols etched in stone, songs passed in ritual, myths repeated across generations. These endure. The more the prophecy is erased, the more it hides in resonance, waiting for those who know how to listen. Suppression does not prove truth, but it often proves significance. What is so dangerous about a prophecy tied to a red moon? What do they see in it? A shift in power? A rebalancing? A return? Whatever the answer, it was enough to mobilize popes, kings, censors, and spies across centuries. It was enough to burn libraries and erase names, enough to turn silence into a weapon. But suppression, like prophecy, is a cycle, and cycles always return. The fire that consumed Jacques de Molay and the arrest orders that crippled the Knights Templar sent ripples through Europe that no monarch or papal decree could contain. While the official story paints the fall of the Templars as swift and conclusive, the truth, like the prophecy that may have survived them, left deeper, stranger impressions. These were not grand revolutions, but subtle shifts, strange reactions, eruptions of fear, obsession, and transformation that radiated outward from the moment the flames touched stone in Paris. These were the immediate consequences, unfolding not only through history's halls of power, but in symbols, dreams, and fear-soaked silence. In France, the death of de Molay was quickly followed by a series of unsettling omens recorded in both ecclesiastical and civilian accounts. Monks in Poitiers claimed that within hours of the execution, the moon turned an unnatural red once more. Though astronomical records show no scheduled eclipse, villagers along the Loire described a red mist hanging in the sky, while a chronicler in Burgundy wrote of birds falling silent, as if the air itself had turned to ash. The church dismissed these stories as hysteria, but the people remembered. And in the years that followed, whispers grew that the Grand Master had cursed his killers. Yes, but also opened something. Not a portal, but a timeline. What followed was a string of unconnected but eerily symbolic events. Within a year of the order's dissolution, both King Philip IV and Pope Clement V were dead, just as de Molay had allegedly predicted from the flames. The king fell during a hunting expedition, reportedly after complaining of a crushing pressure in his chest and a vision of a shadow across the sun. Pope Clement, for his part, died after a short illness that left his skin darkened and his lips stained red, described by one physician as an eclipse drawn upon the flesh. Whether these deaths were natural, cursed, or something else entirely is debated. But what matters is perception. In the minds of those who had witnessed the fall of the Templars, these deaths confirmed that something unnatural was unfolding. In England, the ripple took a more philosophical form. The arrests and eventual execution of Templar members was met with suspicion. Records show that several high-ranking Templar knights in England were quietly released after public interrogations, with no formal charges pursued. The clergy and nobility feared a popular backlash, but there was another layer. Private correspondences between knights and abbots contain warnings of a celestial reckoning. One bishop wrote that the moon has borne witness to injustice, and the stones beneath the chapel tremble with memory. This phrase, oddly poetic, was later echoed in 17th century Masonic writings describing lunar cycles and hidden catacombs beneath cathedrals. In Iberia, particularly Spain and Portugal, the consequences were spiritual. Prophetic literature surged in popularity, especially texts dealing with the astronomical omens. The writings of Joachim of Fiore, long dormant, found new audiences. His visions of a second order rising in silence and blood raining from the stars were reinterpreted through the lens of the Templar collapse. Portuguese monks began crafting diagrams showing the progression of 7 lunar eclipses, a pattern that some claimed would culminate in an age of revelation. Whether or not these charts were directly inspired by the Templars is unknown, but the timing is suspicious. Why would such a motif suddenly dominate the religious imagination of Iberia in the wake of the Order's fall? In Italy, art responded to the shift in a quieter, but no less telling, manner. A series of murals painted between 1314 and 1325 feature veiled moons, hooded figures, and crimson streaks. These works, often unsigned and scattered across monastic libraries, share a chilling consistency. One fresco, hidden behind an altar in a ruined chapel outside Florence, shows a figure wrapped in red cloth, holding a scroll aloft beneath a bleeding moon. Around him, a circle of 7 stars burns in gold. Their title, added centuries later, was Custos Temporis, Keeper of Time. Meanwhile, among the surviving Templar-affiliated communities, those who had escaped to Scotland, Germany, and beyond, the ripple was not fear, but movement. The remaining brothers began to meet in secret, not only to mourn their fallen brethren, but to preserve what had been nearly lost. Private rites resumed in hidden chapels. Star charts were recopied by hand. The Crimson Codex, though still a mystery, began to appear in whispered references. The Book of 7 Nights, the Scroll of the Silent Moon, the Gate that Turns with Blood. Some believe these survivors were not only preserving knowledge, but preparing for something, a return, a cycle not yet complete. And the people noticed. Folk traditions shifted subtly in regions touched by the Templars. Peasants spoke of bad moons, times when animals would not sleep and dreams turned red. In rural Germany, one account from 1322 describes a wandering preacher warning of a red eclipse that would mark the end of one age and the rise of another. He claimed to be a messenger of the veiled order, a phrase never before used in any religious doctrine. He was arrested, flogged, and released. His words, however, survived. They passed from village to village, and when an actual eclipse occurred in 1324, albeit a minor one, people gathered in silence beneath the sky, watching with eyes full of fear and curiosity. For the first time in living memory, a prophecy not found in scripture was shaping behavior. Even within the church, something had shifted. Letters between clerics in Avignon reveal internal debates, not just about the Templars, but about celestial timing. One bishop wrote, "The calendar begins to crack. There are those among us who speak of the veils of the moon and the watchers of the seal. We cannot silence what has already taken root." Though these voices were rare and quickly drowned in orthodoxy, they suggest a momentary rift in consensus. The idea that the heavens might carry messages outside official doctrine had once again entered the room. The ripples extended into political theory as well. Philosophers and writers in the 14th century began to explore notions of hidden knowledge, invisible orders, and the power of time as a governing force. While these were often cloaked in allegory, they contain hints of Templar thought, particularly the idea that power derived not from crowns, but from alignment with cosmic rhythm. To those raised in the fear of papal wrath, these ideas were dangerous, but they spread nonetheless. And And so the prophecy, whether truly spoken in full or only suggested in symbol, began its quiet work. Not as a manifesto, but as a mirror. It reflected something that could not be controlled, the sense that time itself had changed. People began to measure not just years, but omens. They watched the moon, tracked eclipses, feared the red sky. Every major blood moon became an event to fear or revere. And somewhere in that change, the prophecy survived, not as doctrine, but as a lens through which to view the world. That is how power moves when it cannot speak. That is how a ripple becomes a tide. Some stories end when their last witness falls silent, but others, those stitched with mystery, symbol, and flame, echo far beyond their original telling. The Red Eclipse prophecy is one such story. If it was ever spoken in full, its words have long since vanished. And yet the idea persists, not as a line in history, but as a pulse, faint but constant, vibrating through architecture, art, ritual, and whispered myth. While the immediate fallout from the Templar dissolution reshaped medieval Europe, the long-term consequences crept in quieter, stranger ways. Through centuries of reformation, revolution, and rediscovery. Today, the prophecy survives not just in fragments, but in the very frameworks of how we think about secrecy, destiny, and time. It begins with mythologization, the transformation of historical fact into archetype. The Templars, once practical warrior monks, became figures of legend in the public imagination. They were no longer merely defenders of pilgrims or landowners, but guardians of hidden knowledge, keepers of sacred relics, protectors of a truth too dangerous for the world to know. Much of this transformation occurred during the 17th and 18th centuries, when secret societies rose to prominence and romanticized the Templar legacy, pulling from surviving records and speculative reconstructions. One idea, however, always lingered near the center of these myths, a prophecy of return tied to celestial signs. Early Masonic literature is full of veiled references to this return. In the York Rite, for example, the final degrees include a reference to a temple not built by hands, resting beneath the seventh veil. The Knights Templar degree, adopted by several Masonic traditions, speaks of a sealed scroll and a gate of red upon the firmament. These aren't random inventions, they're resonances, intentional or not, of ideas long carried forward in secret. Even the very structure of the rituals, 7 steps, 7 candles, 7 knocks, echoes the 7-cycle model tied to the Red Eclipse. The prophecy also rippled into popular folklore, especially in rural Europe. In parts of Brittany and southern Italy, tales persist of a secret brotherhood who guarded an ancient clock buried beneath a chapel. In Portugal, there are old stories of moon priests who once gathered in caves on blood moon nights to read the stars and chant songs in forgotten tongues. These myths are often tied to warnings. Do not speak when the moon turns red. Do not walk alone when silence deepens. Yet embedded in the fear is fascination, the sense that these nights are portals, not punishments. Art, too, became a vessel for the prophecy's long shadow. In the Renaissance and Baroque eras, paintings began to appear with increasingly complex layers of symbolism. Caravaggio's Sacrifice of Isaac includes, behind the biblical violence, a background dominated by a darkened moon. In Poussin's The Shepherds of Arcadia, one shepherd points not only to an inscription about death, but to a carved eclipse in the background, one easily overlooked. These artists were not Templars, nor necessarily tied to any order, but the motifs, darkened skies, seven-pointed stars, veils drawn across faces, suggest a persistent cultural memory, perhaps not even fully understood by the artists themselves, but inherited nonetheless. In literature, the echoes grow louder. From the Romantic poets to 19th century occult fiction, we see recurring references to blood moons, hidden scrolls, lost orders, and awakenings tied to cosmic events. Mary Shelley, in Frankenstein, writes of a red-shrouded moon that casts no warmth, only memory. Bram Stoker, in Dracula, draws on symbols of eclipses and dark cycles. Even in more modern works, Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, Dan Brown's novels, there is a consistent hunger for hidden structures beneath history, many of which trace lines back to the Templar mythos and its connection to time. Perhaps more surprising is the influence on scientific exploration. While mainstream astronomy dismissed mystical interpretations, early modern researchers like Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton maintained private interests in alchemy, prophecy, and esoteric geometry. Newton, in particular, wrote extensively on biblical chronologies and attempted to align scriptural prophecy with celestial events. While his connection to Templar legend is tenuous, his efforts mirror the same impulse, that divine timing is measurable, and that eclipses mark thresholds, not just shadows. Even architecture did not escape the ripple. In cathedrals built long after the fall of the order, we still find astronomical alignments. The Chartres labyrinth, often walked in meditation, has been linked by some to lunar cycles. The rose windows of Notre Dame de Paris contain red glass patterns that shine brightest during certain lunar phases. One French architectural scholar suggested the placement of certain buttresses reflects a knowledge of eclipse recurrence, though such claims remain controversial. And yet, the deeper the history goes, the more the motif of silence returns. This silence is not passive, it is intentional, a silence that holds space for what cannot yet be spoken. In esoteric philosophy, silence is often equated with containment, a seal, a pause, a breath before revelation. This aligns with the Red Eclipse prophecy's structure, the idea that knowledge is not suppressed by fire, but sealed by time, that the moon's red shadow is not the end, but the sign that the silence is ready to lift. In the 20th and 21st centuries, as occult and alternative history studies expanded, the prophecy evolved again. No longer just a Templar myth, it became part of a larger narrative about lost civilizations, cyclical time, and suppressed truths. The rise of digital platforms enabled the spread of obscure fragments, scrolls, carvings, chapel blueprints, all hinting at an ancient signal embedded in the stars. Fringe scholars proposed models of temporal geometry, suggesting that time behaves like a spiral rather than a line, and that blood moons are points of intersection between cycles. This language, strange and modern as it seems, circles back to what the Templars may have already believed, that the moon is not merely a satellite, but a measure, that red eclipses are not anomalies, but appointments, and that prophecy is not about prediction, but recognition, the act of seeing what has been quietly repeating, waiting for us to notice through myth, art, architecture, science, and secrecy. The red eclipse has persisted not as a single narrative, but as a recurring echo across disciplines and belief systems. It has passed through the hands of masons, monks, mystics, astronomers, and storytellers, each adding a layer, a variation, a verse, but the melody has remained strangely consistent. Now, as the eclipse approaches once more in 2027, the pattern returns, not as proof, but as invitation. An invitation to remember, to reflect, to listen. Some secrets aren't written in ink, but carved in stone, sewn into robes, or whispered between the shadows of architecture and moonlight. The Red Eclipse prophecy, long buried beneath layers of myth, persecution, and silence, survives not as a single scroll or text, but through a language of symbols. These signs were never meant for the masses. They were built for the initiated, those who knew where to look and how to see. Over centuries, they have resurfaced, sometimes clearly, other times buried behind centuries of decay and reinterpretation. But always, they share a common function: to endure where words could not. To begin understanding the visual grammar of the prophecy, we must first recognize its core motifs: red moons, sevenfold patterns, veils, circles within circles, stars, crosses, keys, and silence. These are not mere artistic choices. They repeat with such intentionality that they become a cipher in themselves, a pattern across time, a map to be followed not by roads, but by recognition. Let us begin with perhaps the most dominant, the crimson moon. This symbol appears in hundreds of variations across Europe, on stone carvings, painted ceilings, illuminated manuscripts. One of the earliest examples is found in a 13th century chapel in northern Spain, where a stained glass window shows a blood-red disc eclipsed by a stone archway. Beneath it is a Latin phrase, sanguis aperit ortum, blood opens the gate. The same phrase appears in a Templar codex discovered in Portugal, this time beside a geometric diagram showing a lunar eclipse intersecting a seven-pointed star. The number 7 is another critical thread. In Christian theology, 7 represents completeness, creation, sacrament, seal. In Templar and esoteric contexts, 7 often relates to cycles, stages of initiation, or veils. Across various chapels connected to the Templar diaspora, we find architectural plans deliberately built on heptagonal geometry. 7-sided sanctuaries, 7 staircases, 7 archways. At Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, there are exactly 7 columns in the Lady Chapel that bear unique carvings, vines, stars, angels, and on one, the image of a veiled moon flanked by keys. Keys appear frequently in Templar iconography, especially when paired with moons or stars. In a lesser-known French manuscript, Clavis Lunaris, the image of a silver key with a crescent-shaped bow is repeated alongside inscriptions about timing, blood, and silence. A 14th century altar cloth preserved in a monastery near Lisbon displays 3 keys crossing under a red cross, with the words, apparite sed tes. Open, but be silent. The implication is clear. Unlocking the prophecy was never about public revelation. It was about timed activation, knowing when, not just what. Then we encounter the intersecting circles, often used to represent lunar cycles, eclipses, or union between two realities. Known in geometry as the vesica piscis, this shape appears repeatedly in Templar structures. In many cases, it forms the centerpiece of floor mosaics, dome ceilings, and stained glass windows. At the Abbey of Alcobaça in Portugal, a hidden chamber beneath the altar reveals a mosaic depicting 3 overlapping circles, one white, one grey, one red, culminating in a central point of gold. Some believe this is a visual representation of the prophecy's culmination: eclipse, silence, awakening. Symbols were never meant to remain static. They travel. In 15th century German woodcuts, we see depictions of a robed figure bearing a staff topped with a crescent and a 7-rayed star. In some versions, the figure is blindfolded. In others, they hold a scroll sealed with red wax. These images often carry marginal notes. The hour will pass in crimson shadow, or the seal stirs not by hand, but by wheel. Historians have dismissed these as esoteric nonsense, but when compared across regions, their consistency becomes haunting. Different artists, different centuries, yet the same set of shapes. Across the Atlantic, in the church of San Miguel Arcangel in Mexico, an altar painting from the 16th century shows St. Michael casting down a demonic figure beneath a red-tinged moon. What makes the painting unique is the inclusion of a small Templar-style cross on the hilt of the saint's sword. It is faint, almost lost in the paint, but unmistakable. The painter, a Jesuit trained in Spain, left no records of his inspiration. But it is not the only such painting. Several Latin American churches contain astronomical motifs, eclipses, veiled stars, bleeding suns, that seem out of place for their time and context. If the prophecy traveled with the escaping Templars or their allies, then its symbols followed. Another potent emblem is the rose and the cross, eventually formalized by the Rosicrucians, but arguably predating them by centuries. The red rose, when combined with a cross, represents secrecy blossoming from sacrifice. In one Templar fresco, a rose is depicted blooming over a crescent moon, its petals stained with red droplets. The accompanying text reads, "In petalis memoria, in luna veritas." In the petal's memory, in the moon truth. We cannot overlook the most profound symbol of all, silence. In Templar inscriptions, silence is not absence. It is a living force. Many tombs associated with the order bear the symbol of a single hand raised in a gesture of quiet. In some, the lips are sealed with a line. In others, the face is turned toward a red circle in the sky. A statue found in the ruins of a French commandery shows a cloaked figure seated beneath a tree. Its head bowed, a key in one hand, and the other pressed to its lips. This image, echoed in dozens of variations across Europe, has become the signature icon of the prophecy, the watcher in silence. It is through these symbols, layered, repeated, adapted, that the prophecy continues to breathe like an underground river. It finds cracks in history's foundations and flows onward. For those who know how to read, these patterns are louder than any parchment. They speak in geometry, in color, in light, in shadow. Even in modern times, artists, architects, and mystics continue to draw upon this legacy, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps not. Buildings aligned to eclipses, rituals timed to the blood moon, books adorned with stars and veils and seals. Sometimes what we call coincidence is merely inheritance, unrecognized but undeniable. And now, the patterns converge again in August 2027. When the Red Eclipse casts its shadow once more, the symbols may awaken in ways we can't yet measure. Sunlight through stained glass will strike old mosaics. Moonlight will fall upon forgotten carvings. Scrolls long dismissed may be read anew. For prophecy does not always scream. Sometimes it waits, patient, encoded, and glowing red beneath the quiet pull of a lunar veil. Some legends are content to remain in the past, but others, particularly those whispered through time rather than written, have a way of finding their way back. The Red Eclipse prophecy, like a shadow that returns every 7 steps, has not vanished. Instead, it has resurfaced in new forms, transformed by modern minds, shaped by digital tools, and reinterpreted by those still drawn to the tension between mystery and meaning. The language may have changed, but the pulse remains the same. And now, as the year 2027 approaches, the prophecy enters the contemporary mind, a world of satellites, social networks, and scientific precision. Yet still, the old questions remain. The most striking echo in modern times begins not in a cathedral or a lodge, but at the heart of astronomical science. According to NASA, a penumbral lunar eclipse visible across parts of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East is scheduled to occur on August 17th, 2027. The timing is curious, not because eclipses are rare, they occur roughly twice a year, but because of the specific geography of this event. The path of visibility closely aligns with ancient Templar roots, including Spain, Portugal, southern France, and regions near Jerusalem. In isolation, this is simply a poetic alignment. But for those tracking the patterns outlined in old diagrams, the 7-cycle model embedded in Templar star charts, the 2027 eclipse matches a node of significance. In fact, fringe researchers and independent scholars have quietly compiled what they call the Sanguine Table, a chronological map of red-hued eclipses, each spaced according to known Templar intervals of 7 lunar cycles, roughly 18 years. The 7th eclipse in this particular lineage falls unmistakably in 2027. These researchers claim that this event represents the completion of a loop first initiated during the fall of the Order. Though mainstream science rejects such symbolism, the alignment of eclipse dates with Templar-relevant history is enough to provoke renewed curiosity, and curiosity breeds interpretation. In recent decades, numerous books, blogs, and videos have emerged discussing the Templar prophecy, not merely as legend, but as a timeline awaiting fulfillment. Some claim the prophecy is tied to the return of a hidden order. Others, that it signals a global shift in consciousness. More radical voices suggest the prophecy was never religious at all, but technological. A code left behind by an advanced understanding of celestial cycles that modern science has only begun to rediscover. A few even speculate that ancient knowledge, long encoded in geometry and astronomy, will be unlocked by artificial intelligence aligned with the timing of the eclipse. Of course, many of these interpretations exist on the fringe, but their growing presence reflects something deeper. A modern hunger for mystery in an age of constant information. The idea of a prophecy too large to see in one lifetime becomes magnetic. The Red Eclipse then becomes not just a prediction, it becomes a mirror, reflecting our fears, hopes, and spiritual confusion in a world obsessed with certainty. One of the more grounded interpretations comes from scholars who study mimetic inheritance, the way symbols and stories pass through generations, regardless of origin. They argue that the Red Eclipse prophecy endures not because it is true in a literal sense, but because it taps into a universal pattern. Cycles of rise and fall, silence and revelation, concealment and emergence. These scholars trace the use of eclipse imagery through contemporary political art, protest symbolism, even fashion. One researcher published a study showing that during recent lunar eclipses, Google searches for Templar eclipse and crimson prophecy spiked dramatically, especially in English, Portuguese, and Arabic-speaking countries. Why? Perhaps it's because in today's world, fractured by uncertainty, overwhelmed by data, and haunted by ecological and spiritual collapse, the idea of a hidden order preparing to return feels reassuring. Even if we don't believe the prophecy literally, we want to believe there is a pattern, a meaning, a sign that chaos is not the end, but part of a larger design. That maybe, just maybe, there are those who remember what the rest of us have forgotten. In elite academic circles, there have also been strange stirrings. A private astronomical research group known as the Kronos Institute, operating out of Geneva, published a classified internal report in 2021 suggesting the 2027 eclipse aligns with a pattern of astronomical recurrence first mapped in medieval sky texts. The report, leaked by an anonymous source, hints at increased electromagnetic fluctuation and anomalous gravitational readings surrounding specific eclipse sites, though the findings were quickly retracted and disavowed. The fact that such a report was written at all suggests a quiet unease, or at least interest, within certain scientific enclaves. Beyond science, popular media has embraced the prophecy with increasing intensity. Several streaming documentaries have featured segments on the Templars' survival, linking their symbols to everything from global banking conspiracies to ancient extraterrestrial contact. While much of this content is sensationalized, some of it introduces serious academic voices. A recent docuseries titled Lunar Thresholds devoted an entire episode to the Red Eclipse theory, analyzing the repetition of eclipse imagery in medieval architecture and proposing that the Templars were not hiding a treasure, but a timeline. Online forums and digital archives are compiling references to the prophecy with almost devotional zeal. Social media groups are dedicated to decoding chapel blueprints, translating obscure Latin phrases, and sharing eclipse alignments. In one such community, a Portuguese user posted a photo of a centuries-old sundial recently uncovered in a Lisbon garden. The markings on the dial seemed unremarkable until lunar light had hit it at a certain angle, revealing a hidden crescent and 7 dots etched in red stone. The image went viral, drawing speculation that it was part of a larger network of markers across the Iberian Peninsula. Perhaps the most intriguing modern interpretation comes not from historians or mystics, but from philosophers. In a recent lecture at a university in the Netherlands, a professor of metaphysical time theory argued that the Red Eclipse prophecy is less about a specific moment and more about pattern recognition. The Templars, he said, understood something that quantum physicists now confirm. Time is not linear. It folds, it loops, and within those loops are echoes. We call them prophecies, but really, they are reminders. So what then is the Red Eclipse reminding us of? That we are part of a story older than we remember. That truth requires silence before it could be spoken. That time itself may be seeded with invitations, moments where we are meant to stop, look upward, and wonder. You may not believe in prophecy, but even disbelief in the face of such symmetry becomes a kind of reverence. The blood moon draws near. The sky prepares once more, and beneath its coming shadow, old words rise again, not to predict, but to reflect. For every symbol decoded, another appears, more obscure. For every document uncovered, a page is missing. For every theory confirmed, a deeper mystery waits in silence. The story of the Red Eclipse is not a completed manuscript. It's a palimpsest, overwritten through centuries, scraped clean and rewritten again by hands both cautious and courageous. It is a puzzle that resists finality, offering tantalizing clarity before retreating into shadow. Even after all the scrolls, frescoes, rituals, alignments, and whispers, what remains most potent are the questions we still cannot answer. We do not know, for example, whether the Red Eclipse prophecy was ever written in full. The so-called Crimson Codex, often cited as the prophecy's definitive text, has never been produced. Its name appears in footnotes, fragments, and whispered tradition, but not in any recognized catalogue. Was it destroyed during the Purge? Was it divided and scattered among trusted guardians, like a mosaic designed never to be viewed whole? Or was it never a book at all, but a concept, a celestial logic transmitted in ritual and symbol, passed from generation to generation without ever being inked on parchment? Even if a central text once existed, we have no consensus on who authored it. Was it Desmarais himself, one of the Templar archivists like Anselm of Poitou? Or does it predate the order entirely, originating instead in Gnostic scripture or ancient astronomical systems hidden beneath Jerusalem and brought to light during Templar excavations? Some point to clues suggesting an even earlier origin. In a 14th century monastic commentary on the Book of Enoch, there is a curious reference to the cycle of 7 moons ending in red, where silence breaks the seals of heaven. If this text predates the Templars, could the prophecy be far older, only adopted and preserved by them? Another major gap lies in the timeline itself. The 7 cycles motif recurs constantly, but no definitive start date has ever been agreed upon. Some count from the Council of Vienne in 1312, when the Templars were officially disbanded. Others choose 1307, the date of the mass arrests. Still others count from the execution of Jacques de Molay in 1314. Depending on the interpretation, the final eclipse in the sequence would fall anywhere from 2025 to 2030. The most cited model, of course, lands on August 17th, 2027, when a lunar eclipse will cast its red shadow across parts of Europe and the Middle East. But even this is speculative. We are chasing ghosts in celestial mechanics. There are also contradictions in the prophecy's tone. In some accounts, the eclipse signals awakening, a return of light, a restoration of order. In others, it portends collapse, upheaval, the unraveling of systems. Is it a warning or an invitation? Is it destruction or rebirth? The ambiguity seems intentional. Perhaps prophecy by its nature resists singular purpose. Perhaps the red eclipse marks a threshold, not an event, a moment when the world may tilt. But what happens next depends on who walks through the door. Further confusion comes from location-based inconsistencies. Multiple sites claim to hold physical remnants of the prophecy. Stone circles in Scotland, vaulted crypts in Portugal, secret manuscripts in Swiss lodges, oral traditions in North Africa. Yet none agree on the whole. Each holds a piece of the mirror, but the reflection shifts depending on where you stand. Some interpret the prophecy as a call to re-establish a physical order, the rebirth of the Templar lineage. Others believe it is metaphysical, the reactivation of hidden knowledge encoded in consciousness, architecture, or even the fabric of space-time. Still others reject both views, arguing that the prophecy was never about the future, but rather a coded commentary on secrecy, betrayal, and silence. And then, there is the silence itself. One of the most persistent features in Red Eclipse lore is the role of silence, not as ignorance, but as preservation. It appears in almost every related inscription, from Tacite et observat, be silent and observe, to the more poetic, only silence endures, carved into the foundation stone of a ruined Portuguese abbey. But what does it mean? Is silence the key to keeping the prophecy alive, avoiding corruption by keeping it hidden? Or is it the final seal? The very thing that must be broken of the truth to emerge? Even in Masonic rituals tied loosely to the Templar line, silence plays a central role. Initiates are often required to take vows of secrecy before hearing the ritual phrases linked to eclipse imagery. Why? This question leads to an even broader one. Why a prophecy at all? What purpose did it serve? The Templars were warriors, yes, but they were also administrators, bankers, and scholars. Why would such a practical order obsess over a celestial event hundreds of years in the future? Unless they believed it was more than superstition. Unless they believed that time itself could be predicted, navigated, shaped. Not in the magical sense, but in the architectural one. Perhaps the prophecy was a blueprint, meant not to foretell doom, but to align efforts across generations. Protect this scroll, build this chapel, mark this wall, light this candle on this date, a chain of actions, each small, each hidden, that only makes sense when you step far enough back to see the whole. But we're still too close, and so we stumble across missing links, pages torn from books, seals broken but unread, chapel windows realigned during renovation, stone carvings eroded by centuries of rain. What was meant to be read during specific lunar light is now dulled by electric bulbs. What was whispered in ritual is now remembered only in half phrases and poorly translated Latin. The archive is fractured, and no one holds the master key. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the prophecy was never meant to be owned, but discovered again and again. Each generation finds a different piece. Each society interprets it through their own fear or hope. To one, it is judgment. To another, resurrection. To a third, a geometric riddle coded in eclipses and silence. There is even the possibility that the prophecy has already been fulfilled, and we simply missed it. Maybe it was never about a red moon in the sky, but a symbolic event, a revolution, a shift in power, the quiet arrival of new knowledge. Or perhaps it is yet to come, still waiting for the right eyes to see, the right minds to recognize the pattern. Uncertainty, in this case, is not a failure. It is the prophecy's most powerful weapon. It forces you to look again, to question, to trace stone with your fingertips, waiting for the cold imprint of something not carved, but left behind. It pushes you into the space between history and myth, where imagination and intuition are not enemies of truth, but tools to reach for it. So, we are left with questions. What is the seventh seal? What stirs beneath the red shadow? And when the eclipse comes, will anything happen at all? Or will the silence remain? Silence. That is where it all begins, not with the clash of swords or the crackle of fire, but with the hush that follows. The space between words, between actions, between the turning of one age and the next. The Templars may have been warriors and builders, but their most enduring legacy was not written victory or conquest. It was carved in silence, woven through the stones of forgotten chapels, pressed into the folds of old rituals, and carried across centuries at the mouths of those who spoke less than they remembered. The Red Eclipse prophecy, if it endures, does so not in thunder, but in the deep, persistent stillness beneath our modern noise. Why silence? Perhaps because it preserves better than sound. Words once spoken are vulnerable. They can be misquoted, misused, burned. But silence is a vault. It holds meaning without distortion. It waits. The Templars, accused of heresy and treason, faced inquisitors who demanded clarity. Yet many of them offered none, not because they were empty, but because they were full. Too full, perhaps, to risk the crude blades of public misunderstanding. To the order, silence was not passive. It was intentional, a form of spiritual architecture, a seal in itself. And what of memory? The memory of a brotherhood scattered, of scrolls hidden, of towers aligned to stars now forgotten. Memory is what fills the silence, the unspoken lineage, the glimmer in a ritual that outlived its source. In countless places, from the hills of Portugal to the depths of French cathedrals, there exist design choices with no recorded purpose. doorways that open to walls, windows that shine red only once every few decades, labyrinths built into floors where no congregant was meant to walk. What are these, if not acts of memory? Echoes of something once known and now remembered by design, if not by mind. The Red Eclipse prophecy exists in this tension, between silence and memory, between the known and the withheld. And perhaps that is why it has lasted. A prophecy shouted from rooftops rarely survives the fire, but one carved into cycles, embedded in stone, veiled in darkness, that one has a chance. There is something deeply human in this kind of secrecy. The instinct to encode, to preserve meaning, not by stating it, but by hiding it safely within layers. We do this in myths, in music, in architecture, in ritual. We tell the same stories in new shapes, waiting for the listener who knows how to hear. The Templars were no different. If they believed that a certain moment in time, a red eclipse, a seventh seal, would open a door or mark a transformation, they would never speak it plainly. They would build for it, wait for it, guard it. Not because they were afraid, but because they were committed to legacy. And legacy is something far deeper than legend. It is what survives not in books or monuments, but in action and repetition. Legacy is what you do when you are no longer seen, when the future becomes your audience. To the Templars, the Red Eclipse may not have been an ending or a singular event. It may have been a mirror, a moment to reflect what had been carried, hidden, and prepared. A moment when silence breaks not in sound, but in recognition. In philosophical terms, silence and legacy are closely entwined. The Greek notion of aletheia, truth as unhiddenness, suggests that truth does not arrive with force, but emerges slowly as veils fall away. In this view, the Red Eclipse becomes not a prophecy of doom or divine intervention, but a symbolic unveiling. A moment when something long buried beneath assumptions, power structures, or forgetfulness returns to view. Not suddenly, not loudly, but completely. And if silence is the medium of this unveiling, then memory is its compass. What you remember, even if imperfectly, orients you toward what you seek. It allows you to navigate the unspoken. The very structure of prophecy depends on this, on people remembering just enough to feel the tremor when the pattern returns. That tremor is what has kept the Red Eclipse alive, a shiver in the collective story, a ripple through ritual, a hesitation in the face of a red moon. We live now in an age that fears silence. We fill it with noise, with content, with commentary. But the Templars knew that silence could speak. That prophecy, if spoken too soon, could be destroyed. That timing matters. They were less prophets than gardeners, planting signs across the ages, trusting that the right moment would come. That someone, perhaps you, would stand beneath the blood-red moon and understand what they meant, not in exact words, but in resonance. And what do we do with this legacy? Do we dismiss it as romanticism, myth, symbolic nonsense? Or do we listen for what still hums within the stones and stars? To believe the prophecy is not to believe in supernatural destiny. It is to believe in continuity. That meaning can survive destruction, that symbols can outlast kings, and that the future can be shaped by the careful placement of memory, Even now, we do not fully know what the prophecy meant. We may never. But perhaps it was never meant to be fully known. Perhaps the red eclipse is not a message, but a mirror, one that asks, what do you see when the world turns red and the sky falls silent? Do you feel fear or recognition? When you walk through a cathedral and see the eclipse carved into the ceiling, or hear a story about a hidden scroll, or find a 7-pointed star in the corner of an ancient wall. What stirs inside you is not certainty. It is legacy waking up, a whisper through time, a pattern beneath the noise, a moment of stillness in which history becomes personal. The Templars are gone, but their silence remains, their symbols remain, and the red eclipse still approaches. You have followed the path through fire and stone, through red moons and ruined chapels, through the silence between centuries. And now, as the story draws to a close, if it ever truly closes, you find yourself standing not at the end, but at the edge. Because this was never just a history. It was an invitation, a soft whisper through the noise of time, calling not for belief, but for attention, not for obedience, but for curiosity. You are not a spectator here. You are a seeker. That, perhaps, is the final truth of the Red Eclipse prophecy, that it was always meant for the one who listened long enough, the one who stayed up late, watched the shadows move, felt the hair rise on the back of their neck at the sound of wind through old stone. It is not about prophecy fulfilled in spectacle. It is about the quiet recognition that something has always been moving beneath the surface. Something timed, something woven, something still unfinished. What does it mean to be a seeker in the modern age? It does not mean swearing oaths in candlelit crypts or chasing relics across continents. It means asking better questions, reading what others overlook, feeling the weight of symbolism in places where others see decoration, understanding that silence is not emptiness, it is an archive, that rituals, even forgotten ones, carry encoded memory, that every piece of this puzzle, however scattered, still pulses with meaning because it is you who gives it life. The Templars, for all their flaws and contradictions, understood something fundamental about time, that it is both structure and spirit, that it moves like a river, but echoes like a bell. Their survival, if it can be called that, depended not on armies or gold, but on the idea that legacy could be seeded across centuries through architecture, through number, through whisper. And now, the moon turns red again. In August 2027, the sky will repeat a moment the Templars may have foreseen, feared, or revered. You will stand beneath it, perhaps in a city, perhaps far from the ruins and chapels we've spoken of, and you will look up at that blood-washed circle. You might remember this story, you might not, but somewhere inside you, something ancient may stir. You'll feel it in your chest, not because the moon controls fate, but because you are now part of the pattern. This is not a story about answers. It never was. It is a story about endurance, the kind that does not shout or demand attention, the kind that waits, that carves itself into stone and trusts the moon to find it again, that moves from hand to hand not through conquest, but through care, through people who choose to remember, even when remembering seems foolish. And there are more of you than you think. You are not alone in feeling that history has been edited, that something deeper exists in the spaces between official narratives, that the echoes we sometimes hear in sacred places are not mere acoustics, but resonances, the remains of a melody still playing, too low for most to notice. You are part of that chord now. You carry it with you. The question is, what will you do with it? You could walk away, call it myth, dismiss it as symbolic nonsense, a bedtime tale dressed in crimson and gold. You could move on, or you could watch more closely, ask more questions, listen to old stories with new ears, find a chapel that aligns with the moon, run your fingers across a weathered stone, read between the lines, not just of books, but of buildings, of rituals, of the gaps between events in history. Because the Templar prophecy, whether real or imagined, has never been about a single day. It has always been about awakening. And maybe that awakening isn't explosive or public or world-ending. Maybe it's something far more dangerous. Maybe it's quiet. Maybe it happens in minds and hearts that begin to look differently at time, at symbols, at power. Maybe the real threat of the Red Eclipse wasn't what it would change, but who it would inspire to keep looking. So what if you are the next watcher? What if you are the one who remembers just enough to keep the pattern intact, to pass it on? Not in code or secrecy, but in the shape of questions you ask, in the way you carry wonder. The Red Eclipse is not just prophecy, it's legacy in motion. The door doesn't close here, it opens. You just have to decide whether to walk through it, because now the veil has been lifted, even if only a little. The silence has spoken, even if only in a whisper, and that whisper, it belongs to you now. So when the moon turns red again, look up, listen carefully, and ask yourself, what if silence were not empty? What if it was waiting,